4.1 The Industrial Revolution and Capitalism in England. Hunter-gatherer societies revolved around using labor to generate enough food to survive. The invention of agriculture spawned the empires and later the feudal system. These economies relied on agricultural production and the exploitation of slave and peasant labor by the elites, who seized any available surpluses for themselves. During the era of mercantilism, the importance of trade and commerce came to the fore, although the wealth of mercantilist economies was still primarily based on agricultural output from slave and peasant labor. Thus, human economies from the beginning of time revolved around labor and agriculture. The Industrial Revolution changed everything. The creation of the industrial factory signaled the rise in importance of capital, machinery, equipment, buildings, and other technological resources used to produce factory goods. First in England, then across Europe and around the globe, the Industrial Revolution made ownership of capital the major source of economic power and the foremost driver of change in the economy. Capitalism is an economic system in which the capital goods and other productive resources, land, natural resources, are privately owned and are bought and sold in markets based on the pursuit of profits. Under a capitalist economic system, workers, instead of laboring for themselves and keeping the proceeds, sell their labor power to the capitalist in exchange for wages. The capitalist, as the owner, gets to keep any surplus that is produced. Under capitalism, the primary focus of all economic activity is profit. An owner takes a large sum of money and invests it in setting up a factory and hiring workers. Those workers produce a commodity of some kind. That commodity is, hopefully, sold for a greater value than the initial investment. Money M, registered trademark symbol commodities, CM registered trademark symbol cent or money M. Early entrepreneurs had to advance a considerable sum of money ahead of time to cover costs, with no assurance that they would get a substantial return once a commodity was produced. This uncertain situation made them, as described by economic historian Paul Mann, tyrannical, hard, sometimes cruel. The Industrial Revolution began around 1760 in England with just such a group of hard entrepreneurs. The reasons for the Industrial Revolution's conception in England, as opposed to elsewhere, are important because they help us understand the key institutions that provide the basis for a capitalist economic system. First, England was ideologically better suited toward a money-oriented, invention-driven capitalist economy. As the heart of the Protestant Reformation, English society was less opposed to the notion of making money. As a result, members of the English aristocracy were early supporters of commerce and manufacturing, and businessmen who made a lot of money were accepted into high society much more readily than else. Where in Europe, this worldly attitude also carried over into an interest in science and engineering. The Royal Society was founded in London in 1660 to promote natural knowledge and establish principles of scientific inquiry and experimentation. England became the international scientific leader, which led to a host of discoveries and inventions. The establishment of a national patent system to protect the rights of inventors to the profits from their discoveries further spurred technological change. Second, England was the site of the most comprehensive enclosure movement and, consequently, the most complete elimination of feudal society, which resulted in the most secure system of property rights. The interest of the English aristocracy in exporting wool to obtain gold and foreign luxuries made it particularly aggressive in seizing the common lands from the peasants. Thus, the privatization of land and the creation of a vast quantity of landless laborers were more prevalent in England than elsewhere. A factory owner could only start an industrial operation if the inputs he needed were available. He needed laborers who were willing and able to work for reasonable wages and land that could be rented or purchased for the site of his factory. Both of these conditions were present in England. Third, England was wealthy, and this created a large market for manufactured products. Manufacturing large quantities of goods in a factory is only profitable if there is a sizable market for those goods. There must be enough people with ample income to create sufficient demand for large quantities of products. England's vast colonial empire, rigged to generate profits from slave trading, piracy, colonial commerce, and more, created a relatively large, for that time, upper middle class and a very rich upper class. These groups were only too happy to consume the latest manufactured goods. The colonies also served as suppliers of cheap raw material. Isles, and as market outlets for English manufactured goods. The extensive colonial trade of England also included a well-developed transportation system which made trade in manufactured goods relatively easy and low cost. Also, England was lucky to have large deposits of coal and iron ore, which were crucial in early manufacturing. Luck, alongside the vast colonial empire, meant plenty of cheap inputs and captive markets for English manufacturers. The result was a system in which immense profits could be earned if entrepreneurs were willing to invest sufficient sums of money. Many were willing to do so, and their successes encouraged other entrepreneurs to follow. With cheap labor and inputs available to purchase, land available to rent, profits to invest, and an ideological approach favoring the acquisition of money, the way was paved for the rise of capitalism. In the process, there was a fundamental shift from labor and land as a part of social and cultural relations to labor and land as commodities to be bought and sold. In such a system, the owners of capital had the greatest amount of power in society. Landowners needed rent from their land in order to generate income. The best way to generate income from the land was to rent to a capitalist, who would use the land to its greatest capacity. The best way for a laborer to earn a living was to work for a capitalist. Given that there were many more people looking for work than there were jobs, the capitalist employer had a huge advantage in the relationship with workers. Most workers of the time had to take whatever wage rate the employer offered and accept work even in oppressive conditions, since the alternative was starvation. As British economist Joan Robinson observed in her book, Economic Philosophy, the misery of being exploited by capitalists is nothing compared to the misery of not being exploited at all. Meanwhile, the capitalists, who had to advance a considerable amount of money without the guarantee of a return on their investment, worked to drive very hard bargains with workers and landowners. Thus, with the rise of capitalism in the mid-1700s, we see for the first time in human history the notion of individual gain, the profit motive, becoming an all-pervasive force in society, driving the behavior of workers, landowners, and capitalists. There was deep unease in England as capitalism was stirring. The mercantilist system was not able to solve the major problems of society, especially the massive amount of poverty. The early capitalist enterprises were very promising, but their expansion was limited by the strict regulations on trade put into place to benefit the monopolistic merchants. Into this environment stepped Adam Smith, who is usually credited with inventing the field of economics, and who argued that a lightly regulated market capitalist economic system would solve the problems of mercantilism.